This is a revision lesson for the A-Level Britain topic, and your first question for your revision is, in what ways did the franchise fail to represent ordinary people before 1832? In this lesson, you'll hear about the problems with the franchise before 1832 and the reasons why people would start to argue for reform following the Napoleonic Wars. So the problems with the franchise before 1832 can be split into 4 areas. The first one is the size of the franchise. The second is corruption. The third is representation, and the fourth is power of the crown. When we talk about the franchise, what we mean is simply the right to vote. So we're going to start with looking at the franchise. So first of all, who were people actually voting for? So this is the same system that we have in modern politics. People vote for the representatives who they will send to the House of Commons. From the House of Commons is chosen the cabinet, and within the cabinet there is a prime minister who's leader of that political party. You can see in this picture that there is a kind of a bigger yellow box drawn around the Prime Minister and the Cabinet, which says Privy Council. That's because at the time, the ministers in the Cabinet were the monarch's ministers, and they effectively were there to do the day-to-day jobs that the monarch had previously done. So you can see that the power of the monarch is there already. The House of Commons wasn't the only legislative body. The other legislative body was the House of Lords, which obviously was not elected. And you can see here that the House of Lords was made up of Lords Temporal, which were mostly life peers, and Lords Spiritual, which were the bishops. So when people voted, they were already limited in the influence that they could have, because you've got these other powerful bodies that they were contending with, obviously the monarch and the House of Lords. But the bigger problems came from the fact that the franchise itself was incredibly limited. So in 1780, between 3 and 5% of the adult male population could vote. We don't know exactly because there wasn't any electoral registration at this time, but this is a prediction. What qualified people to vote depended on whether you lived in a county or in a borough. You can see the definition of a borough on your screen, and a county is any constituency that wasn't a borough, and that was normally a more rural area. But a county like Lancashire included huge cities like Manchester, so it varied. If you lived in a county, you had to be a 40-shilling freeholder in order to be able to vote. So that meant you had to own land worth 40 shillings. If you lived in a borough, that varied. But there were some constituencies like Westminster where thousands of people could vote because all householders could vote. But that was very much the exception. In most boroughs, less than 100 people could vote. And in some, which were rotten boroughs, which I'll come on to in a second, very few people could vote, less than 20 or even less than 10. So the reason why the proportion of people who could vote at this time was so small was because you had to be a major landowner in order to be able to vote. Next, we're going to move on to look at corruption. So corruption is the practice of influencing elections through bribery. Corruption relied on the fact that a very, very small number of voters existed. Because there were so few voters, it was easier to influence who they voted for. The small size of the population and the fact that there was no secret ballot meant it was very easy to influence voters. Essentially, voters were influenced by 2 things. First, they were influenced by who owned the land that they lived in. This was an age when society was dominated by the aristocracy. The aristocracy were the celebrities, they were the millionaires, they were the people who people looked up to and were incredibly deferential towards. This is an example of an aristocratic seat that belonged to Lord Rockingham. It's near Rotherham. And if you live in an area where within a few miles walk you have a house like this, and the person who lives in that house tells you to vote for a certain person, you're going to vote for that person. So the first reason why people voted a certain way was because of deferential respect for the aristocracy. So one way that corruption worked is that if an aristocrat owned some land, they could usually determine who was elected within that land. The second way that corruption worked was through direct bribery and through something called treating. So this is a painting by Hogarth that shows treating before an election. In this painting, the Whig candidates put on a party, basically, for the voters of the town. So you can see that there are prostitutes, there is huge amounts of alcohol, there is bribery being paid directly to voters. This was called treating because in the days leading up to the election, the different candidates would basically try and win over voters and persuade them to vote for them. As a result of this, elections were incredibly expensive. Because of the expense of elections, seats were often uncontested because it would be a huge risk to try and take a seat from someone, and it would cost a huge amount of money. An example of this is in 1784, there were just 72 seats that were contested. That's out of a total of 550. So just 72 seats out of 550 were contested. And that demonstrates just how expensive it was to contest a seat. Because of the expense of elections, MPs often relied on aristocratic patrons in order to win their first election, whether that was through persuading people that lived in their area to vote for their preferred candidate, or whether it was through funding the bribes that would need to be paid to persuade people to vote. The aristocracy could support candidates for the House of Commons. And a further way that corruption worked is that occasionally rotten boroughs or pocket boroughs would essentially be owned by members of the aristocracy. The best example of this is Old Sarum, which was a town which had been incorporated by the Crown in the medieval period, but had basically become completely unoccupied. It was just a hill. It had 7 voters, and none of those voters lived in Old Sarum. So essentially, Old Sarum was owned by an aristocrat, and the aristocrat could choose who would win that election with very little effort because there were only 7 voters. Corruption meant that the franchise was failing to represent ordinary people because even those people who could vote were not voting according to their political instinct or their political persuasions. They were voting because they'd been paid to vote. And essentially what that meant is that the franchise was not representing ordinary people. It was representing those people who could pay the bribes, which was the aristocracy. Next, we're going to look at how far ordinary people were represented in Parliament. Representation means that citizens are present in policy, as in the best interests of the citizens are considered carefully when policy is developed so that representatives act in their best interests. Because the system of elections meant that the aristocracy rather than the voters were able to have an influence, and the voters represented such a small number of the population anyway, the people that were represented in the House of Commons were very, very limited. 1/5 of the House of Commons were sons of peers. These were the obvious choices from MPs because MPs were so reliant on aristocratic patrons, it was very normal for members of the aristocracy to choose their own relations to be MPs. In the cabinet, the aristocracy was even more well represented. This is William Pitt the Younger, who was made Prime Minister in 1783. And in his cabinet, there were just 3 MPs. The rest of the cabinet was made up of the House of Lords. So the aristocracy also already had a very large influence in the House of Commons, but in the cabinet, that influence was even stronger. Now, even if you didn't have an aristocratic patron to support your entry into the House of Commons, you were guaranteed to be a wealthy landowner because you had to have property in order to stand as an MP. That property had to be worth anywhere in between £200 and £300. So you could only be an MP if you were a very wealthy landlord. Therefore, the members of the House of Commons were guaranteed to represent the landed interest. That was either because they owned land themselves, or because they owned land themselves and members of their family owned even more land, or because they owned land themselves and their patron owned even more land. So MPs were always looking out for people who owned large quantities of land, and therefore ordinary people were not represented by the House of Commons. The final reason why the franchise failed to represent ordinary people before 1832 is the power of the Crown. So for the beginning of our period, from 1780 up to 1810, the monarch was George III. He was still officially the monarch from 1810 to 1820, but his son, George IV, acted as regent during that time because George III had a mental illness. So the power of the Crown increased significantly while George III was in power. That's because George III was someone who wanted to interfere in the way that the government was run. So whereas George I and George II had allowed their ministers to govern for them, George III attempted to have more of a say. One example of how he did this was by appointing his prime ministers, even when they didn't have a majority in the House of Commons. Although this was relatively unusual for the monarch to do, there was nothing that prevented them from doing it. And because the monarch inspired a huge amount of loyalty in the vast majority of people in the House of Commons, the MPs tended to automatically support the choice of the king. This was the case when William Pitt the Younger was made Prime Minister in 1782. He didn't have a majority in the House of Commons, but very quickly gained one because the independent MPs in the House of Commons, and a range of other MPs as well, voted with Pitt rather than with a particular party because Pitt had the support of the king. The reason why the king was able to command so much influence in the House of Commons was not just natural deference towards the crown. There were other reasons as well. Two of those were patronage, sinecures, and then a final one were pensions. So the king had a huge amount of patronage at his command. This meant that he had a number of offices that he could gift to people. Amongst those offices were things known as sinecures. So sinecures were offices which were granted to individuals that required little to no work, but carried with the position significant financial benefits. So, for example, one MP was paid by George III to be someone who turned the spit that the king's meat would be on. Now, obviously, an MP was not really going down to the king's kitchens and doing that. That was done by people in the kitchens. But nevertheless, they were paid to do so. If you were receiving a sinecure from the king, you would be pretty much guaranteed to vote for the minister that the king supported, or the government that the king supported. A pension was similar. This was in return for an actual service. It was often given to people who had fought for the crown. And again, receipt of a large payment from the crown every year meant that you were likely to support a government that the king supported. So sinecures and pensions allowed the king to have a huge influence in the House of Commons. At the same time, the king was responsible for appointing prime ministers and for approving the ministers that the prime minister had chosen. So effectively, the king could appoint and dismiss governments. This was seen in the case of Pitt, when Pitt was made prime minister despite the fact that he didn't have a majority in the House of Commons. And this was something that was very influential over prime ministers. So as prime ministers ruled, they had to bear in mind that the king had the power to dismiss them at any time. Now, rather than allowing that to get to that point, prime ministers would occasionally resign if they realised that they had lost the favour of the king. So, for example, Pitt in 1801 disagreed with the king over the issue of Irish emancipation. Ireland joined the Union with England, Wales and Scotland in 1801. And at that point, Pitt argued that such a large number of Catholic citizens deserved to be able to hold public office, and therefore the laws that prevented that should be removed. George III strongly disagreed, and so rather than fall out with his monarch, Pitt decided to resign. So these three things, the natural deference that the crown commanded, pensions and sinecures, and the crown's ability to appoint and dismiss governments, combined together to mean that the crown had a disproportionate influence on the franchise. And indeed, the king was by far the most important single figure in politics until 1832. So what did these 4 issues actually mean for the state of the franchise? We're going to go on now to look at a couple of case studies which demonstrate the problems with the franchise and how these problems kind of manifested themselves in reality. Now, when you combine these factors together, the result you get is that the political system as a whole, both the House of Commons, the House of Lords, and the executive, so that's the cabinet, the Prime Minister and the monarch, all of them represented the landed interest rather than ordinary people. And hopefully you can see how these 4 things meant that that was the case. So there are 2 sort of case studies that I'm going to introduce now that I think really reflect these problems. And so whenever you're writing an essay and you're thinking about the problems with the franchise before 1832, and you'll never get a question specifically on that, but you're within your kind of questions, you will consider that at some point. Whenever you're kind of writing your analysis, once you've done your description, which we've just spoken about now, and you've done your analysis, to develop your point, it's a really good idea to use a specific example to show that your explanation is in fact the case. And these are 2 examples that you could use now. The first case study you could use for this is the rejection of Pitt's moderate reforms in 1785. In 1785, Pitt suggested that a number of rotten boroughs, of the worst rotten boroughs, should be abolished in 1785. And this was based on the fact that there was a clamour for reform in the general population. So the association movement, which we'll talk about in a little bit more detail in the next video, was prominent at this time, and there were many members of the gentry who were asking for reform. And Pitt's response was to suggest that rotten boroughs were abolished. But the House of Commons rejected this, and this reflects how kind of dominant the commitment to corruption was in the House of Commons in 1785. That even though it was clear that the people, and not just normal people, but wealthy people, wanted reform, the House of Commons was not prepared to vote to end a practice that made their positions more secure. They were not prepared to vote to end a practice that made the power of the aristocracy in the House of Commons incredibly strong. And so they voted to keep the rotten boroughs, which meant that the aristocracy's influence over the House of Commons remained strong, which meant that that corruption remained common in elections. So this shows that the people in the House of Commons were highly committed to the continued practice of corruption. Clearly, therefore, they're not representing ordinary people before 1832. Another case study you could use is the introduction of the Corn Laws in 1815. So the Corn Laws is probably one of the most unfair pieces of legislation ever to have been introduced. It came at a time when the country was suffering from a depression, so prices were falling, but also people were losing their jobs. But concern about falling prices led to the House of Commons, which obviously was made up of landowners who therefore relied on the farming industry. The House of Commons introduced a law that said that cheap foreign grain could only be imported once the price of British grain had increased above a certain level. So basically what that meant was that the price of grain was kept at a higher level than it would have naturally been in the if the price was set by the market. So people were losing their jobs, therefore the price of grain goes down. But rather than allowing that to happen, the House of Commons voted to prevent that from happening. So people were losing their jobs, but the price of grain remained high. Obviously incredibly unfair, and certainly does not represent ordinary people. Who this did represent was landowners. Even ordinary farmers didn't benefit that much from this. This is more the people who are collecting the rent from ordinary farmers. They want to be able to continue to charge the same amount of rent as they always have done. So they're trying to keep the grain at a higher price. Okay, so those 2 examples can be used if you ever kind of want to use a case study to put across any of the issues that we've spoken about here. So make sure you've got notes on that topic, and the next video will be on how far the power of the crown changed between 1780 and 1832.